Blessed be the kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and forever, and to ages of ages. Amen. Have you ever taken a course that completely changed your outlook, that completely changed your way of thinking about a particular topic? Years ago, well, I've had that experience numerous times over my life, but years ago, I was ordained, and then I was assigned to be an associate at a parish for about 3 years, and then I was moved to my own parish and began working in a very small area, just wonderful, salt of the earth people. Well, when I was an associate, I began working on advanced studies at St. Louis University, studying philosophy and theology. Well, when I ended up moving parishes, St. Louis U was kind of a distance away, and it was also very expensive. And so I thought, I'm going to go and continue my philosophical studies, but I'm going to do so at a secular university, Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. I had done my undergraduate work there, and I began taking philosophy classes there. I was working towards my PhD. I didn't finish it, but I took a number of courses there and loved so many of the professors there. Dr. Steinbach, looking at issues of Marx and Husserl, and he's truly a phenomenologist. I took classes with just a number of professors there that I deeply respected and admired. One of those professors was Dr. Stephen Timon, and I took a class that completely revolutionized my way of thinking about philosophy and theology. After all, I went to Roman Catholic Seminary. I studied the history of philosophy, the ancients, the medievals, and then the breakdown of the medieval synthesis from the Roman Catholic perspective with seminal thinkers such as Kant and what we can and cannot know, particularly when it comes to religious claims, essentially the breakdown of faith and reason, or even do we have, starting with Descartes, any knowledge of the exterior world, and Hume's whole critique of causality and whatnot. So, I studied so much of the modern philosophers, but when I took a number of courses down at Carbondale, and one course just completely transformed the way I thought, because I saw with enlightenment, you had this strong separation of faith and reason. And I thought, in one sense, that was the final word, that there were a number, for instance, of Catholic thinkers, philosophers who rejected the modern project, or people who try to find issues with the modern project, or people trying to operate in the modern project, such as some analytic philosophers who were still finding room for God within the system. But for the most part, continental philosophy just seemed to be almost godless. But then I took this class by Dr. Stephen Timon, and I want to pull up my notes on this just so I can remember correctly. The name of the course was The Religious Turn in Continental Philosophy. And I just wanted to take a look at the syllabus real quick. I'll read from the syllabus for a minute. In what is called in this country continental philosophy, there has unfolded in recent years a so-called religious turn. In some sense, this is a retroactive movement, as religious dimensions have been uncovered in the thought of a number of thinkers closely associated with the turn to postmodernism. Philosophers such as Derrida and Levinas, not to mention Heidegger, have been found to have secreted within the core of their work elements that answer to this description. This discovery has led to a championing of the cause of a return to religious thinking on the part of several more contemporary philosophers. These include Marion, Nancy, and on this side of the Atlantic, Caputo and Kearney. Predictably, there has also been a reaction against this turn in the name of ardent secularism. Into the camp we could place the name Zizek. Thus, there arises a series of controversies over the place and potentials of religion in postmodern life. This course represents an attempt to take the measure of the questions involved. And then kind of looking at the books that we read during that time. Levinas, God, Death, and Time, Otherwise Than Being, Beyond the Verse. Derrida, The Gift of Death, Acts of Religion. Caputo, The Prayers and Tears of Derrida, Religion Without Religion. Nancy, Disenclosure, The Deconstruction of Christianity. Marion, God Without Being. Kearney, A Hermeneutics of Religion and Atheism. And then the last one, the last week, Zizek, Cogito, Madness and Religion. Derrida, Foucault, and then Lacan, The Puppet and the Dwarf, The Perverse Core of Christianity. This was such a fascinating course that I took, and it introduced me to so many different religious thinkers. I think sometimes the best courses, it isn't necessarily the content, but it's being introduced to different religious thinkers different thinkers that we might not have been previously exposed to. And so I was very thankful for this course because it introduced me to many people I probably would not have encountered. I remember my bishop being very disappointed after I left St. Louis U and was taking, and he thought there could be nothing substantial offered at a secular university. And one day during a meeting, so what are you learning? And I mentioned, I'm taking a class on the religious turn in contemporary Continental philosophy. And then we began discussing so many of these thinkers that he obviously had a great deal of knowledge and reverence for. And so at that point, then he saw where I was coming from and basically encouraged me in my studies. So today, I'm going to explore what many scholars call the religious turn in contemporary Continental philosophy. This is a stream of, as I mentioned before, post-Heideggerian thought, where questions of God, revelation, and faith re-enter philosophical conversations, not by going back to the pre-modern metaphysics, but through the very ideas posited by modernity and postmodernity, phenomenology, language, and ethics. Today, I want to focus on three people that, in one sense, matter the most in my reading, and that is Jean-Luc Marion, John D. Caputo, and Richard Kearney. And I'll end by asking how their ideas might shape the way that we pray, preach, and even practice hospitality. So what is the religious turn? Well, we already saw that in one sense from reading the syllabus, but I want to kind of put in a quick backstory. So in the early 20th century, Continental philosophy moved through Husserl, the phenomenology of consciousness. Remember, for Husserl, he's wanting to return to the things themselves. And then Heidegger, his questions, particularly the question of being, that question of ontology. And then after particularly Heidegger, there's this strong death of God movement that's taking place mid-century. you have the issues regarding the Holocaust and the death of God movement, and what is the human situation in which we are living, where humans can annihilate each other in nuclear war. But then starting in the 1960s through the 1990s, a number of thinkers began looking at some of these insights in figures such as Heidegger, or again, Levinas. Levinas, and I'm not spending a lot of time on Levinas here, but Levinas, I believe, really with his notion of ethics, explodes modern ideas of thinking through ethical situations. Levinas uses hyperbole, I think, to the extreme, but really bringing out ethical obligations. I'm already late to the game. I'm born late. People have been dying before I came, and as a result of that, I have failed people who needed my assistance, but I wasn't even here yet. Or I have a duty, I have an obligation to give, not just excess. Remember, what does Jesus even say? He holds up the woman giving to the temple those 2 small coins, and he says she's given more. For Levinas, it's giving bread, not our excess bread, bread out of one's own mouth. We give out of our own need, out of our own limited resources, because of the obligation of other people. And of course, Levinas also dedicates his book, and Otherwise Than Being. There's 2 dedications, one in that was translated, and one that wasn't, that remained in, I think, was it Hebrew, and basically dedicating it to one of the memorials to all the victims of National Socialism. When you read Levinas, you're cut to the core. Oh my, I am not living out the obligations that I need to. So starting in the 1960s through the 1990s, there are a number of thinkers: Levinas, Derrida, Ricoeur, Marion, Caputo, Kearney, and others who are re-engaging religious themes. They don't simply want to go back and retrieve the medieval synthesis. They recognize you can't go back again. But there are many things that, there are many religious themes even in modernity. Heidegger, honestly, I really struggle with Heidegger, not only with his verbose language, but even his involvement with National Socialism. You know, at one time, Heidegger was held in such high esteem as essentially the philosopher, the one who ended metaphysics, the one who overcame it and gave us the true categories, or helped us return to being in itself, and Dasein, and those existential movements of being towards death, and the rise of technology and how that is subverting modern life and modernity and whatnot. And yet there's that lingering issue of his involvement in National Socialism. And one of the best books, I think, on that is John D. Caputo's Demytholizing Heidegger. Caputo early on wrote a great deal on Heidegger and saw Heidegger, in one sense, he wrote a book comparing Heidegger's ontology with that of Thomas Aquinas, and Caputo early on seems to be very smitten by Heidegger. However, as time goes on, he begins realizing Heidegger has no love for basic Christian precepts like mercy. Everything is about sacrifice. But What about love and mercy and kindness and gentleness? What about the flesh and suffering human bodies? Heidegger's system does not take such things into consideration. So these thinkers are not simply reasserting dogma, they're reframing how God, faith, and revelation itself can be thought. There's three shared impulses: a return to experience, not to prove God, but to ask how the divine shows itself or refuses to show itself within human experience. Even Heidegger's famous last interview that was published, and he was talking about on how he was just wanting to prepare the way for God to either reveal God's self or not. There's the critique of totalitization, resist turning God into yet another object in the universe, something that we can master and have control over. And then the ethical primacy. The religious often arises as a call, a summons towards the other, towards justice, towards mercy. There are three distinct pathways that I want to focus on today. Jean-Luc Marion, God as givenness, beyond object. God isn't just simply another object in the system. God is not even, we don't even talk about God having being for Marion. God is other than being, because being itself seems to be in the categories. Revelation is a saturated phenomenon, and his famous, and I've spoken on this one several times before, the distinction between an icon and an idol. Then we have John D. Caputo. I've written a number of little articles. I think I've got one or two published. I've used him at conferences before, speaking about Caputo, and his notion of weak theology. God is an event that insists without coercive existence. It's a call, the call of the kingdom, the call to justice. And then Richard Kearney, anatheism, a return to God after God. That's in one sense. After the death of God, what happens? Well, for Nietzsche, in one sense, he thinks that's going to be the rise of the Superman. That's the rise of humanity stepping up to the plate. No, for these religious thinkers, it is what comes after God. And when I say God, they're little g. What returns after God? God, the God, encountering the divine. But it's a perhaps in the stranger and in the everyday. Opening the door is an act of faith. Maybe it's someone who's going to murder us, or maybe it is the presence of Jesus in the stranger needing assistance. So keep in mind these key words: givenness for Marion, event for Caputo, and perhaps anatheism for Kearney. So first, let's turn to Jean-Luc Marion. I have many of Marion's books, and I deeply love. In one sense, Marion is perhaps the most conservative and Catholic of the three thinkers I'm discussing. He's, in one sense, really trying to operate in a much more traditional framework, but using modern philosophy. So phenomenology is recentering on donation. Classical phenomenology is wanting to study how things appear. It's not, think of Kant's distinction between how things are in and of themselves and how they appear to us. Well, phenomenology recognizes that we sometimes don't have access to reality in and of itself, but we have to go based upon appearance. So Marion asks, What if we start not from the being of things, but from their givenness, their arriving to us as a gift? The most decisive phenomena are not those that we frame and control, but those that overwhelm our concepts. And this is the notion of the saturated phenomenon. A normal object matches our categories. We go and see an object and, it's a pencil, it's a pen, it's a piece of paper. It just matches, But then we can look at other things. The saturated phenomenon. Think of a beautiful sunset, of a well-done piece of, a well-executed piece of art. Maybe it's a beautiful song that's sung. Emotions just overwhelm us. There's so much more than meets the eye. Think of Revelation. The burning bush, Moses takes off his shoes. He's overwhelmed. It seems to be just another burning bush. Haven't we all encountered just shrubbery burning at different times in our lives? We've got an old bush, we cut it down, we throw it in the fire, and we don't think anything of it. But at this moment, this bush has been burning. There's a Jewish story about on how the bush had always been burning out in the desert, God's presence there. But it took that act of faith of Moses to stop and recognize something else was at work. There's the revelation of the resurrection. It seems to be just yet another tomb. And yet something is different about this. There's the angels, there's the promise of what God has done. There's the revelation, a call from God. There is the face of the other, and this is very important for Levinas, the face. When we gaze into the face of the other individual, we can't reduce. People are not reducible to one another. Every person is singular and unique. Each person has an excess of meaning that I cannot reduce. Oh, that's just another human being. Well, if someone said that about our child or our spouse, we would go and say, no. My spouse has these characteristics. My spouse cannot be reduced to just another human being, or my child, or my dog, or, we recognize they're just not mass individuals in one sense, but people who mean a great deal to us are singular and unique. Last year, I ended up losing my dog, Dexter. He had been very ill for quite some time, and I was day after day after day taking care of him. And after he died, I knew I couldn't replace him. Yeah, we could get another dog, but I knew at the same time it's not going to be Dexter. That next dog isn't going to have all those quirks and characteristics and ways of being that Dexter did. And so there's always that loss. When we lose someone that we love, human or animal, we can't replace them one for one. The face of the other, for Levinas, has an excess of meaning that I cannot reduce. And like I was saying before, great art, a masterpiece that refuses to be exhausted by interpretation. Such a saturated phenomenon gives us more than what we can grasp. Our concepts lag behind the gift. Also, for Marion is the icon versus the idol. And I've written a lot, and I've given several presentations on that, and I think I know I've done a video or two on this as well. The difference between an icon and an idol isn't the object. but rather it is how the object functions. So, this cross could be either an icon or an idol. An image of Jesus could be an icon or an idol. Let me grab something here. Or even the sacred scriptures can be an icon or an idol. If I'm using the scriptures in a way that, give me the answers to next week's Powerball. Oh, I've turned now to the book of Psalms. I'm pointing at verses 4, 13, and using the scriptures that way to, in form of magic. I'm using the scriptures as an idol, or so an idol, in one sense, closes gaze upon itself. An idol is just, you point to the reality and that's it. That's the issue with idols in the Old Testament, that people thought this is the gods themselves, versus the Israelite God, who cannot be depicted. Why? Because recognizing that God transcends. Now, of course, in time, God makes an icon of God's own self. How? The mystery of the incarnation. So an icon opens the gaze beyond itself. It lets the invisible shine forth through the visible. So applied theologically, true talk of God deflects attention from control and lets God be God. That's why, for instance, in the Eastern tradition, there's a much more apophatic notion of our language applied to God, recognizing our language ultimately fails to describe what God truly is. And then we recognize that God should be without objectification. Marion doesn't deny doctrinal content, but he warns that if we approach God as an object, like all the other objects in the world, then we commit idolatry of concepts. God is encountered in excess. God is truly the saturated phenomenon. It's a givenness that exceeds our capacity to receive. God dwells in unapproachable light. Why? Because the moment that we think that we can gaze upon God, we recognize we cannot. Human finitude is too great when compared to our existence is so contingent. God has a greater way of existing than we do. God has true being, whereas we are contingent being. But even that whole notion of being implies categories, and this is what Marion is warning us about. God isn't an object. God isn't even in the categories. And that is why, for instance, the medievals, with, for instance, St. Anselm, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. We're not even saying God is greater than can be thought. We're saying that God is that than which, recognizing that God isn't even the highest thing in the world, in all of creation. God is outside of the created order. And then, so for Marion, there's also a pastoral resonance. The liturgy. Think of the sacramental celebrations as saturated phenomenon, too full for us to capture. Think of a couple exchanging vows to one another to live out their lives married to one another. This is a saturated phenomenon. We can see the presence of God at work there in their lives, gathering the people together, celebrating the love that God has planted in their hearts. And that's a reflection of the love that Christ has with the church. So the liturgy is a saturated phenomenon. It's too full for us to capture. We need to understand that what we celebrate transcends our understanding. We should build silence. We should use gestures and celebrate our sacraments worthy and beautifully, to emphasize that these are saturated moments, rather than trying to explain everything. Number 2, prayer. We need to approach contemplation as an exposure to givenness, not a technique. God can reveal God's self to us in prayer, and we need to be open to that, to be expecting that there's going to be a givenness, or perhaps not at any given moment. And God is willing to do that not only at those moments that we're expecting, but sometimes those unexpected ways. There's those moments that we see something beautiful in our day, sunrise, sunset, a flower, a butterfly, and it just takes us beyond our normal ways of being, and we encounter God in that very moment. It's a saturated phenomenon. And then I think even our preaching can suffer too, because we many times want to reduce God to certain things, but rather we need, like Jean-Luc Marion, we need to allow God to show, letting Scripture address us as it is, as an icon rather than an idol. Then let's turn to John D. Caputo. Caputo is such an interesting philosopher, theologian, and his notion of the event that insists. Caputo recognizes we need to go beyond metaphysical guarantees to the call of the Messiah. Caputo is extremely influenced by Derrida, and he shifts from asking what God is to asking what happens when God happens. He contrasts existence, a hard presence, metaphysical guarantees, with insistence, a call, a way that God is provoking us to action. For Caputo, he speaks about weak theology. Weak does not in the sense that I'm too weak, but in the sense that it's non-coercive. A divine power shows what divine power is in weakness as an appeal. Forgive, welcome, do justice. The kingdom insists. It does not exist, as he likes to say. It does not overpower. Think of St. Paul's beautiful hymn. Though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. God's power is made perfect in human weakness. Moreover, grace is an event, not a transaction. Grace is not a coin in a moral economy. It is an interruptive event when forgiveness breaks a cycle of revenge, when hospitality disarms fear. God happens in these types of events. And then there is the notion of prayer and perhaps. Caputo loves the word perhaps. Prayer isn't a mechanism to force outcomes. If I pray this prayer, God will do this. It is a risk, it is an openness, it is a vulnerability of ourselves to the event of God, which may come unplanned, which may come like a thief in the night. So for a pastoral explanation, number one, ethics. We should let ministry be a response to the event. We need spaces where mercy can surprise us. Jesus, who ate with the tax collectors and sinners, and others were not pleased with this. We need those structures so that the gospel can insist, not exist. God, for Caputo, is weak. God is calling us to justice. But it's a call that we can respond to, we can heed, or we can ignore. God insists. At any moment I can, and this is one of the issues. For Caputo, does he even believe in a being God? Or is it that God is simply present? God is that, whatever we call it, that's present when I'm doing acts of love and mercy and justice. When I'm heeding that call to feed my neighbor, that is where God is. And so for Caputo, maybe he doesn't even believe God exists in an ontological sense, in a way of being, but God is what's present when I'm responding to that call. Maybe God's only real when I am living according to the call of the kingdom, when I'm engaged in those acts of love and mercy and working for justice. So I think for this way of thinking for Caputo, we need to preach less as an explanation, but more as a summons. What is God calling us to do now? And then Richard Kearney. I love Richard Kearney. In fact, he's probably the author I've read the least of the ones that I mentioned, but the words haunt me. His words haunt me the most. Anatheism and the God who may be. Kearney writes so powerful, and he's wanting to contrast between dogmatic certainty and militant atheism. Kearney is wanting to chart a path after God. How do we, in one sense, conceive of God? The modern critique is often a controlling, tyrannical concept of God, and he wants to return to a much more humble, what he calls anatheism, a turning again to God after God. For Kearney, there is the threshold scene, the stranger. The notions of hospitality and the stranger are very important to Kearney. And as a priest and as someone who answered the door, this is something I often struggled with, knowing that when someone's knocking on the rectory door, what is this person wanting? Are they wanting a handout? Are they wanting spiritual consolation or hope? Are they here to do me harm? I don't know. Every knock at the door is an opportunity, but also a danger as well. Kearney wants to return to this biblical notion of the stranger. Remember, hospitality is so important in biblical culture. We have what Abraham did at Mamre, where Abraham opened himself to vulnerability, taking care of the stranger who was there in his midst. Turned out to be fine for him. It turned out to be the divine presence. And yet, and the promise of blessing that, next year your wife, Sarai, will be with child. Or again, we can think of the story of Emmaus, where the disciples encountered the risen Lord, but they did not see him as the risen Lord immediately. It was only in the breaking of the bread. So for Kearney, the divine often appears incognito and in acts of hospitality. The test of God is the guest of the door. But we have to keep in mind, not every knock that comes is God. And so there's that risk. So the possible God, not God as a finished metaphysical object, but for him, it's the God who may be, the divine possibility that calls our responsibility into actuality. It's not skepticism, it's fidelity to the epiphany wherever it appears. And then imagination and narrative. Kearney stresses poetics. I think in one sense that's what makes him so very unique. Parable, story, sacramental imaginization as the medium where the divine passes by. We host the divine by hosting stories and people. And I often think of that Revelation, the passage in Revelation where Jesus is knocking at the door. I think Kearney really brings that passage alive. So, what's the pastoral implications, pastoral resonance here? Hospitality. We should organize ministries that literally make space for strangers, the refugees, the unhoused, those who are unlike us. We need to have spiritual direction, to be engaged, to recognize the divine in these threshold moments where these ordinary encounters where the divine may appear. And then catechesis should be changed as well. We should recognize that faith is much more of an adventure and a welcome, not only simply an assent to theological truths or propositions. So, I want to look real quick at the convergences and contrasts. All three of these thinkers resist mastery of God by concepts or systems. All three describe the divine as interruptive, a gift that exceeds, for Marion, a call that insists, for Caputo, and a guest who arrives, Richard Kearney. And all three align with ethics. Religion is, in one sense, we don't simply reduce religion, I don't think, to ethics, but particularly we need to spend a lot of time reflecting on the ethical claims, hospitality, mercy, and justice. But each of these thinkers also differ with one another. For Marion, there's a emphasis using phenomenology, how revelation gives itself as excess intuition. As I said, he's probably perhaps the most conservative of the thinkers as far as religious concepts. Caputo, on the other hand, emphasizes deconstruction. He's going the full way of deconstruction with Derrida and theopoetics. God is an event. God does not exist. God insists. God is an event that has no force, but summons us, beckons us. And then Richard Kearney emphasizes hermeneutics and hospitality. The divine is perhaps in the other and in story. So I always kind of think of these thinkers as, for Marion, excess, event for Caputo, and encounter for Kearney. And I think you can see why I think these three thinkers, even though they have different emphases, really can supplement one another nicely. So how can we practice this religious turn? I've often thought about this and would often speak about these philosophical thinkers to parishioners, because I believe people need to be aware of these developments and on how they're becoming part of our cultural framework. You know, before I talk about this for 1 minute, I want to think about and reflect upon Derrida. I didn't mention Derrida. Derrida is not considered to be much of a religious thinker throughout most of his life. And yet, there is that story where a person basically said, I'm going to create a computer program that's can basically produce your next book. It's going to guess what your next book is going to be in the topics, because he's doing all these deconstructive ideas. Deconstruction seems to be antithetical to Christianity, the end of meta-narratives, and is Christianity itself a meta-narrative? And then just as people think they have Derrida figured out, Derrida does something unexpected. He writes, in one sense, a very religious text, more of an autobiography in the sense of St. Augustine's Confessions. And he does that on purpose, and he talks about on how they're both North African, both people kind of outside the empire of their days. Augustine was outside of, Rome was the center at that time, and here he is in Hippo, North Africa, backwaters. And for Derrida, here he is, an Algerian Jew in the time of the French Empire, and the control, and failure to control the Algerian territory. A whole notion of even being outside and of one's own religion at times, that Augustine's mother, Monica, wept for him, and Derrida, here he is, essentially a fallen away Jew, and also lamenting the literal cutting away of his flesh, the circumcision that he had received as a sign of the covenant. And yet here he is, seemingly to be separated from the covenant. I think when you look at people who don't even seem to be religious, like Derrida, and then Derrida can produce such a work like that, I think there are certain people who are not religious by nature. I think I've encountered several over the course of my life. But I think there are other people who you, at first glance, might not think of as religious, but whose religion is very deep underneath the surface. And I think, in my own opinion, the religious turn to Continental, and the religious turn in Continental philosophy, can speak to people who might not outwardly seemingly be religious, but who have a lot of deep religious insights and experiences and ways to live out religion, but maybe not in so formalized context as going to church and being part of the church and whatnot. So maybe there are ways that these authors can help us appreciate the religious turn that's taking place. So number one, Marion, curate saturation. We need, number one, in our liturgies and in our preaching, to make room for God to act. But we need, even in our ordinary lives, to recognize a holiness, the saturated phenomenon. We can look at things that are surrounding us on a daily basis and be amazed by them, trust in that mystery. Or we can preach the call, like Caputo emphasizes. How can we offer forgiveness? How can we serve our neighbor, rather than just simply explaining or giving propositions? God insists God does not exist, and we can make God incarnate here and now. We can make God real, not ontologically, metaphysically, but in my act of doing this thing, God is present. We could host a stranger for Kearney, build rhythms of hospitality, shared tables, guest rooms, community partnerships where the divine perhaps has that possibility to appear. We can guard against idols like Marion, when language about God starts sounding like we control God. You must do this in the name of God. No, we need to return to Scripture, prayer, and the poor. God is addressing all of us. We can't use God for our own power and our own devices to control, but we ourselves are subject to God. Then there's we need to keep a holy perhaps, Caputo and Kearney. Leave space, leave time, leave resources for unplanned graces, for interruptions that are really the kingdom. As I would often joke with people, I'd get up in the morning, have my own idea of how I was going to be a priest that day. But then God happens. Then the question is, am I willing to allow myself to let God be God and I get on board with God's plan? Or do I fight against God? Like, that's not how I want it to be, God. No, God, the crucifixion isn't part of the plan, I don't think. And God's, get behind me, Satan. You don't understand. We want to tell God what we want done, but God has other priorities. Then we need to narrate the epiphanies, invite testimonies where how people have met God in the ordinary, to recognize, how are we going to recognize the divine as the guest, as the unexpected. Then I've got so much more I could say. This is such a topic that I dearly love. These thinkers have deeply influenced my own way of thinking, of believing, but also how I live out my faith. They've helped remind me faith isn't just an abstract set of propositions, but when I'm answering the door, there is that opportunity and there is that risk. Maybe it is Jesus who I will encounter. Maybe as the scriptures say, I'm talking about entertaining angels. Maybe I have truly entertained angels as I've given a food bag or encountered Jesus. Or I also risk opening myself up to destruction, slander, and even death. There is a risk. There is no guarantees. And this is, I think, the biggest insight. Just because you open the door does not mean God is there. It could be someone who wants to wage war, someone who wants to kill me. And yet there's also that opportunity to, if I don't answer the door, I risk that. No matter what I do, there is that risk. There are no guarantees. But how am I going to be faithful to the kingdom today? And maybe it is answering that door. So the religious turn isn't simply a return to pre-modernity. It's not a return to certainty. It is a conversion of attention. We learn to receive God not as an object in our system, but as a gift that exceeds, an event that calls, a guest who arrives. If we live this way, reverent before mystery, responsive to the summons, open to the stranger, we find that philosophy has not taken us away from faith, but has schooled us in how to recognize and welcome the one who comes. May God help us recognize where God is at work in our lives and in the world. Help us to foster that mystery, not reducing people to humanity, but as individuals recognizing the divine at work, the God's presence here and now. Give us hearts to receive one another as gifts. Give us hearts to recognize there are no certainties, but that call at our door may be you in need, and you can truly be fully more real when we open ourselves to those encounters, to those moments. Help us to reflect your love. Help us to reflect you in this world. Amen.